There's a moment in every person's life, royal or ordinary, when the world stops pretending everything is fine. When the carefully arranged smile finally cracks. When the person standing beside you becomes the only reason you are still standing at all. Most people never have to live that moment in front of millions. William and Kate had no choice. This is not a fairy tale about a prince and a princess. This is something far more real, far more raw, and in many ways far more remarkable. Because what happened between these two people, across hospitals, quiet garden benches, tearful conversations behind palace doors, and one extraordinary public farewell that moved a nation, was not written in a script. It was lived, breath by breath, in the hardest season two human beings can walk through together. And somewhere in the middle of all that pain, something beautiful was quietly being built. But to understand the farewell, you first have to understand the love. And to understand the love, you have to go all the way back to the beginning, to a cold Scottish university, a sheer dress on a charity catwalk, and a young prince who paid £200 just to sit in the front row. It was September 2001 when William Arthur Philip Lewis first walked through the gates of the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Not as a prince trying to escape his title, but as a young man desperate to simply exist without the weight of a crown hovering over every conversation. He had spent his childhood navigating grief that most adults could barely understand. He had watched his mother's funeral at the age of 15, stood between his brother and his father, and held himself together in front of a world that was watching. By the time he arrived at university, William was not looking for love. He was looking for air. Catherine Elizabeth Middleton arrived at the same university that same autumn, quiet, and composed in the way that people who have never needed to perform their confidence tend to be. She was the daughter of a self-made family. Her parents had built a business from nothing, and Kate had grown up watching work ethic and warmth exist in the same household without contradiction. She was not chasing a prince. She was chasing her own future, and she had the kind of quiet certainty about herself that made even the most anxious rooms feel calmer. They were in the same course at first, art history, and they moved in the same social circles, but their friendship built slowly and without fireworks. William would later describe Kate as someone who just made sense when everything else felt complicated. She was steady. She was funny. She was entirely herself, without apology or performance. And for a young man who had grown up surrounded by people performing roles rather than living them, that was the most radical thing imaginable. The moment that changed things, according to those close to the couple, came during a student charity fashion show in 2002. Kate walked the catwalk in a sheer dress, poised and completely unaware that the young man sitting in the front row, who had reportedly spent £200 for that seat, had just seen her differently for the very first time. William didn't rush toward her. He sat with the feeling instead, the way people do when something quietly rearranges them. The friendship deepened into something warmer, and by 2003, they had quietly begun dating. But even in those early years, the relationship was not easy. The British press circled Kate like something they had already decided to consume. On her 25th birthday, she stepped out of her flat to find over 20 photographers and television crews waiting outside. They chased her car, snapping through the windows as she drove away. She told William afterward that the situation felt unbearable, not as a complaint, but as a statement of honest truth. William felt helpless in a way that stayed with him. He could not change the rules of the world he had been born into, and he was not yet sure how to bring someone he loved into it without burning her. By early 2007, the pressure had cracked something between them. The relationship had grown strained, not because the love was gone, but because the weight of what it meant to love a future king had slowly become something neither of them had fully reckoned with. William was dealing with his own fears, his own unspoken doubts about what kind of future he could honestly promise. Kate had reached a point where she needed something more than hope. In a direct conversation, one that those close to them described as quiet but painful, she asked him for assurance about their future. William, honest to a fault, told her over the phone that he could not promise marriage yet. They agreed to take time apart. It was a short split, measured in weeks rather than months, but it left a mark on both of them that neither would forget. A source close to the couple later told a royal biographer that William had seemed completely broken during those weeks, worried that he had lost the one person in his life who knew the difference between the crown and the man wearing it. Queen Elizabeth II, who had a remarkable ability to see what people were not saying, noticed her grandson's low mood. She invited him to Sunday lunch for a private conversation. Nobody knows exactly what was said in that room, but what is known is that William came out of it with a quieter kind of certainty. He did not chase Kate dramatically. He did not arrive at her door with declarations. What he did was something simpler and in many ways harder. He showed up differently, more present, more honest, less afraid of what the future might ask of him. And Kate, who had used the time apart to rediscover herself outside of the relationship, found that she had come back to it with something she did not have before: choice. She was not staying because she had to. She was staying because she wanted to. That distinction mattered enormously to both of them. By July 2007, they were photographed near each other at the concert for Diana, close enough to signal without announcing. By 2008, Kate was standing beside William at his RAF Wings ceremony, his first official formal appearance where she was visibly present, not as a girlfriend sneaking in through a side entrance, but as someone beginning to take her place in a story she had chosen. She was not dressed to impress the cameras. She was dressed to be there. The difference, to anyone who understood her by then, was everything. The years between 2008 and 2010 were years of building something private and real in a very public world. William served as a military pilot. Kate continued her work, her life, her own identity separate from the relationship. They traveled together quietly when they could. They built the kind of domestic rhythm that couples build when they have decided, without saying it aloud, that this is the person. When William finally proposed in October 2010, in Kenya, with his mother's sapphire and diamond ring, Kate said yes in the way people say yes when they have already made up their mind long before the question was asked. Their wedding on April 29th, 2011 was watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. But the moment that stayed with those who were there in Westminster Abbey, and with many who watched from living rooms and street corners and office break rooms, was not the dress, not the carriages, not the carefully rehearsed vows. It was the look on William's face when Kate walked down the aisle. He turned to his brother Harry and said something quiet that Harry responded to with a grin. Later, it was revealed he had whispered that she looked beautiful. It was such a simple, human thing to say in a moment so saturated with spectacle that it cut through everything. He was not reciting a line. He was just a man looking at the woman he loved, unable to hold the feeling in. 3 children came in the years that followed: George in 2013, Charlotte in 2015, Louis in 2018. With each child, the family became something more textured, more real, more grounded in the ordinary rhythms that William had craved since boyhood. There were school runs and weekend walks. There were birthday cakes and muddy wellies left at the door. Behind the palace gates and the official schedules, a family was living its life in the small, unheroic, irreplaceable ways that make a home. But life, as it always does, was building towards something harder. And in the autumn of 2023, something shifted in Kate's body that nobody could yet name. The world did not know it yet. William did not fully know it yet. But the season they had been building toward, not the coronations or the titles or the public milestones, but the season of choosing each other through something real and terrifying, was quietly drawing close. By December 2023, Kate had undergone planned abdominal surgery. The recovery was expected to be routine. It was not. There's a particular kind of silence that descends on a family when a word is spoken that changes everything. It is not the silence of a room gone quiet. It is the silence of the air itself, holding still, as though the world is waiting to see if the people inside it will hold together or come apart. In the weeks following Kate's surgery in December 2023, the palace issued careful, measured statements. The operation had gone well. The Princess of Wales would be recovering at home. She would not be returning to public duties until after Easter. The language was composed, professional, precisely calibrated. But behind every careful word was a family navigating something they were not yet ready to share, because they barely understood it themselves. When cancer was discovered during the course of that surgery, the world Kate and William had built together shifted beneath them in a single moment. A source close to William would later describe it as being hit by a bus. One moment, life was normal, he said, and the next, everything changed. He worships her truly. She's his world. And when the diagnosis came, it was as if the ground beneath him vanished. William had known grief. He had known it at an age when most children are still learning how to ride a bicycle, had known it in the public, and the unspeakable private sense had carried it with him like something sewn into the lining of who he was. But this was a different geography of fear. This was not grief for someone already gone. This was the terror of watching someone you love stand at the edge of a possibility that is too large to look at directly. This was the fear of being the person who has to hold it together for everyone else, for the children, for the public, for the institution, while inside, everything is shaking. Kate, by all accounts, moved through those early weeks in a way that said more about her character than any speech ever could. She was the one, in many of those quiet conversations at Adelaide Cottage, who kept the tone steady. She was the one who decided, with remarkable clarity, how and when to tell the children. George, Charlotte, and Louis needed to know that Mummy was ill and would have to go back to hospital. The conversations were not easy. They were not performed for an audience or filtered through a press release. They happened in the way the most important conversations in families always happen, quietly at home, with everyone slightly unsure of what to say next, but saying it anyway because silence would have been the crueler option. William described 2024 as the hardest year he had ever lived through. He said it in a conversation with actor Eugene Levy, not in an official royal speech, not in a carefully staged interview, but in a candid human moment that stripped away every layer of royal composure. The hardest year he had ever had. From a man who had stood at his mother's funeral at 15 and delivered a eulogy with the composure of someone twice his age, those words carried enormous weight. Because it was not just Kate's diagnosis. In the same terrible stretch of weeks, his father, King Charles, received his own cancer diagnosis. Two people he loved most in the world, carrying diagnoses that the public would eventually learn, but that arrived for William in terrible and private succession. There is something almost impossible about what William was asked to do during those months. He had to be present enough for Kate that she felt supported, but composed enough in public that the institution of the monarchy, already under pressure, already navigating a period of transition, did not appear to be fracturing. He had to answer questions from 3 young children who needed their father to tell them the truth without drowning in fear. He had to continue his public duties with the kind of quiet professionalism that the role demands, knowing that behind every handshake and official engagement was a man who was, as his friend said, floored. But what happened in that hardest year was not only fear and darkness. What happened was also the unveiling of something the two of them had been quietly building for 20 years without fully knowing it. The ground had been prepared long before the storm arrived. Kate began chemotherapy in late February 2024. She moved through the treatment with a discipline and a grace that even those close to her found extraordinary. The days at Adelaide Cottage were long and careful. The children were kept in school, kept in their routines, kept as anchored as possible in the ordinary life that Kate had always insisted was the most important thing she could give them. William was present. Not performatively, not for the cameras, but in the actual unglamorous day-after-day way that love shows itself when it is not being watched. There were mornings he made breakfast. There were evenings he read to the children when Kate was too tired. There were nights, documented by no one, when the two of them sat together in the quiet of a house that the outside world was not permitted to enter, and just existed beside each other in the particular intimacy of two people who have chosen each other through something genuinely hard. On a Tuesday in March 2024, Kate sat in front of a camera in her garden. No grand backdrop, no formal setting, just the simple pale light of a late winter afternoon and the bench where she and William had sometimes sat together on ordinary evenings. She had written the words herself, with William's support, and she delivered them not as a princess performing a duty, but as a human being telling the truth to people who deserve to hear it. She looked directly into the camera, composed and genuine, and told the world that cancer had been found, that she was in the early stages of chemotherapy, and that she was taking things one day at a time. The response was immediate and overwhelming, not in the tabloid sense, not the frenzied speculation or the intrusive questioning that had defined so much of the couple's relationship with public life. Something different happened. People felt it. They watched a woman sit in her own garden and say something honest, and something in that honesty cut through the usual noise. Her composure was not distance. It was courage. And the world, which had spent months speculating and worrying and filling the silence with its own theories, went quiet and then went warm. Russell Myers, the royal editor who was writing a book on the couple during this very period, described the video as delivered with such grace, perfection, and empathy that it was incredibly emotional. Every person in the room, he wrote, knew it was a huge moment. But what made it a moment was not the announcement itself. It was the way Kate made the announcement. She had thought not just about what to say, but about how her words would land on the people receiving them, on mothers and fathers and patients and children and friends of patients, all watching from their own private corners of difficulty. She was thinking, even in her own hardest season, about other people. That was Catherine, Princess of Wales, in the clearest possible light. William watched from just off camera. Those who were present that day described him as still and pale, wearing the expression of someone trying very hard to be the steady ground that another person needs. He had asked how she was doing that morning. She had told him she was ready. He believed her, because in 20 years of knowing her, she had never said she was ready when she was not. The months that followed were months of deep and private labor. Kate continued her chemotherapy through the spring and into the summer. She was seen occasionally, a brief appearance at Trooping the Color in June, where the sight of her standing with her children on the Buckingham Palace balcony moved the crowd below to something close to relief. She was thin. She was clearly still in the middle of something difficult. But she was there, and the fact of her being there upright and smiling on a summer morning with George, Charlotte, and Louis close around her told a story that no statement could have communicated. This family was not broken. This family was holding. Behind the scenes, William was doing the thing he had always done better as an adult than as a young man. He was staying, not performing loyalty, not demonstrating devotion for the cameras, but simply persistently staying. He had rearranged his schedule in ways that the palace rarely publicized. He had cut engagements, canceled travel, declined invitations that in previous years he would have attended without question. The people close to him did not need to be told that he had made a choice. The choice was visible in every day that passed. In September 2024, Kate announced that she had completed her chemotherapy. The statement was simple and understated in the way that genuinely significant things often are. She had finished. The treatment was done. And though she was careful to note that the road ahead still required caution and continued monitoring, the weight that lifted from the people who loved her, and remarkably from millions of strangers who had spent months worrying alongside her, was palpable and real. William, when he heard she had finished her final session, did not make a public statement. He did not need to. What he did was private and entirely his own, and in its privacy, it was the most eloquent thing he could have done. Some things are not meant for the world. Some things belong entirely to the two people living them. By late 2024, the family was beginning to move forward. Adelaide Cottage, where Kate had spent her chemotherapy days in quiet recovery, was being left behind. They were moving to Forest Lodge, their new home, larger, readier, built for the next season of their life together. It was not an escape. It was something more deliberate, a farewell to one chapter and an opening of another, carried not with ceremony, but with the simple, forward-moving energy of a family that has survived something difficult and chosen to keep going. The hardest year was ending, but its lessons about presence, about love without an audience, about what two people can hold each other through when the noise of the world has no access to the room. We're not ending with it. They were being folded into who William and Kate were now, quietly and permanently, the way all the most important things are. And then, in the cold, early months of 2025, another farewell came of a different kind. A man the royal family had trusted with their lives was gone. And the world was about to see something it had never quite seen before. The morning of the farewell arrived the way English mornings often do in winter, gray and still, and carrying a chill that settles in the bones rather than on the skin. The kind of cold that does not announce itself loudly, but simply makes itself at home in the body, reminding everyone present that the day ahead requires something more than composure. It requires endurance. Outside St. George's Chapel, the stone steps held their silence. People arrived in quiet clusters, their voices low, their movements careful in that particular way people move when they're inside a grief that belongs to someone else, but that they have been invited with great trust to witness. There were no cameras on official tripods. There was no red carpet, no rehearsed crowd management, no carefully staged backdrop. This was not that kind of day. The man they had come to mourn had spent his entire life moving through rooms without drawing attention to himself. And even in the formal architecture of farewell, that quality seemed to hold. He had been one of those men that institutions depend on and history rarely records. A long-serving counselor to the royal household, trusted by King Charles for decades, known to William and Kate not as a name in a palace directory, but as a voice at the end of a phone line in the middle of complicated nights, a calm presence in rooms where decisions were being made under enormous pressure. He was the kind of person who knew when to speak and, more crucially, when to be silent. He knew the difference between advice and instruction. He knew that the most useful thing you can give someone navigating power is not certainty, but steadiness. And he had given it generously for years to people who were not always able to ask for it openly. When he died, the official statement was brief and measured as he would have wanted. But inside the palaces, and particularly for Charles, William, and Kate, the loss was something that the official language could not fully reach. Losing someone like that, those close to the family said, means losing a witness to your private life. Someone who knew the human being behind the title. Someone who had sat in the room when the mask was off. Charles arrived first, his shoulders carrying the particular roundness that accumulates in a man who has worn a heavy crown for longer than he expected to wait for it. He was in his late 70s now, navigating his own health challenges alongside the relentless machinery of the monarchy, and the weight of this mourning was visible in the set of his face. Not broken, but deeply marked. He had been king for only a few years, and in those years he had said goodbye to his mother, faced his own cancer diagnosis, watched his family fracture in public ways that left wounds not yet fully healed, and now was saying farewell to one of the few people who had known him across all of it. The grief on his face was real, and it was not hidden. Behind him, William and Kate walked close together, not holding hands. The moment was too public, the setting too formal, but close enough that the space between them was no space at all. Their steps were almost in rhythm without appearing to be. It was not choreographed. It was something else entirely. It was the movement of two people whose bodies had learned, through the particular education of shared hardship, to orient toward each other without thinking. The crowd that had gathered, small, respectful, mostly silent, did not cheer. They watched, and in watching they saw something that the official photographs would later try to capture, but never fully could. A couple that had come through something and whose togetherness now had a texture that togetherness does not have before it has been tested. Kate had announced her remission in January 2025, a moment that brought a kind of collective exhale to the public that surprised even those who had been watching closely. People who had never met her, who had watched her video from a garden bench 11 months earlier with tears running down their faces, had been carrying a low and persistent worry ever since. The announcement that she was officially in remission landed not as news, but as relief, the kind that makes a person realize, only in its release, how heavily they had been holding their breath. For William, standing beside her at that announcement. It was something even more private and unmeasurable. He had watched her endure the chemotherapy. He had been in the rooms where the courage required was not the kind anyone applauded. And now she was standing in remission, whole and forward-looking and still entirely herself. But the remission had also changed something in Kate. Those close to her described a shift in her approach to life, a philosophy, she privately called it, of intentional living. She had begun to decline non-essential engagements, not out of weakness, but out of deliberate choice. She had made a decision with remarkable clarity that the things she gave her time and her energy to from now on would be things she chose with full awareness, not things she attended because they were on a calendar. She called it her new normal. And what made it remarkable was that her new normal was not smaller than her old one. In many ways, it was larger, more present, more purposeful, more grounded in the specific, and irreplaceable rather than the general and obligatory. William had watched this change in her and found it, by his own private account, one of the most quietly extraordinary things he had ever witnessed. People who were close to him describe a man who had emerged from the previous 2 years different. Not harder, but deeper. More willing to name what mattered. More willing to let the things that did not matter fall away without ceremony. The version of William who walked into St. George's Chapel on that cold morning was not the young man who had once been afraid to promise his future. He was a man who had sat beside his wife through the worst of it and stayed, not because duty required it, but because he could not imagine any version of his life in which she was not at the center. Inside the chapel, the service was quiet and human in a way that royal events rarely are. There was no balcony. There was no military band. There was a simple order of service held in royal hands, and the particular stillness of a small congregation that had gathered not to perform mourning, but to genuinely feel it. Charles sat near the front. William and Kate were close by, and the phrase that had been quietly circulating among palace staff in the days since the death, the words that had been chosen not as an official line, but as something more personal, something that had slipped through the usual filter of royal communication, was present in the room without being spoken aloud. We mourn his great loss in our hearts and souls. It was rare language for the palace. It was the language of people who had loved someone and were saying so without apology and without the usual protective distance of institutional grief. What the cameras caught, in the careful half-silence outside the chapel, was only the surface of it. Charles walking to his car, his face set in the composure of a king who is also a human being. William with his hand briefly touching Kate's back. Not a gesture for the photographers, but the instinctive, unconscious motion of a man reaching toward the person beside him. Kate with her eyes clear and her head slightly bowed, carrying the morning with a particular grace. She had always carried hard things, not by pushing them away, but by meeting them directly and walking through. The crowd on the grass did not raise their phones. People held them low, as though lifting them too high would break something fragile and worth protecting. There is a kind of collective decency that sometimes surfaces in crowds when they sense they are witnessing something genuinely private, even in public, even in the full exposure of a royal event. And this crowd found it. They watched in a respectful silence that carried more warmth than any applause could have. After the service, William and Kate returned to their children and the full, forward-moving weight of their lives. There were emails waiting. There was a diary that never stopped. There were 3 children who needed their parents to come home and who had never once been able to fully understand why the world outside always seemed to want pieces of the people who belonged most completely to them. George was growing into a young man who would someday carry his own impossible weight. Charlotte moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who has learned by watching what it looks like to be genuinely strong. Louis, the youngest, still carried the brightness of a child who does not yet know how much the world will ask of him. But what all 3 children would carry into their lives, what no photograph or biography or documentary could fully convey, was the knowledge of what they had seen. They had seen their mother face something terrifying and face it with honesty and grace. They had seen their father make the choice, quietly and persistently and without fanfare, to be present. They had seen that love, real love, does not look like a fairy tale. It looks like showing up. It looks like staying in a room. It looks like two people choosing each other on the days when choosing is genuinely hard. Not because the cameras are watching, but because there is no other choice that makes sense. The farewell that touched millions was not a single moment. It was a long string of moments, private and public, devastating and tender, hidden from the world, and sometimes bravely visible within it. It was William's face on a bench in a Scottish university, quietly rearranged by a girl in a sheer dress who had no idea what she had just set in motion. It was a phone call in 2007 and the terrible honesty it required. It was a garden in the pale light of March, and a woman telling the truth to a world that needed to hear it. It was a chapel in winter, and two people walking close together, their steps almost in rhythm, carrying between them everything they had been through and everything they were still choosing. That is what people felt when they watched. Not the spectacle of royalty, not the theater of public mourning. Something older and simpler and far more durable than either. They recognized it because they had lived versions of it themselves, in hospital waiting rooms and kitchen conversations and the ordinary, invisible moments when someone you love reaches for your hand in a dark room. Not because anyone will ever know, but because in that moment it is the only true thing left to do. William reached for Kate, again and again, in all the ways that reaching looks like when the world is watching and when it is not. And Kate, who had always known the difference between a prince and a man, had been reaching back the entire time. That is the story, not the titles, not the palaces, not the centuries of history pressing down on two people who never asked to be symbols, but became them anyway. The story is simpler and harder and more worth telling than all of that. It is the story of a farewell that was also a beginning, of a love that was also a choice, of two human beings who held on, and, in holding on, gave millions of watching, quietly hoping strangers a reason to believe that holding on is always worth it.